Welcome to the Black Gems Dive In podcast, the podcast where we dive deep into conversations about inclusive cultures and everything DEI. Your co-hosts are Akua and Kendra, and we're thrilled to be your hosts as we explore the crucial topics shaping our workplaces and communities today. In each episode, we'll unpack insights, share stories, and engage with experts to foster a deeper understanding of how we can create more inclusive environments where everyone feels valued and empowered. Welcome back. We are back with another episode of the Black Gems Dive In podcast, and we are super excited. We have a fun conversation today to really talk about some issues that are impacting us on a really large level. And so we're joined by the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies, which is America's Black think tank. We have Hill diversity researchers that are joining us for a conversation. That's Dr. LaShonda Brenson and Kimberly Victor. And we're super excited to have you both join us today. Welcome.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Nice.
So I want to give you both an opportunity to introduce yourselves and tell the folks, a little bit about you, where you're from, how you got into this work, and what you do on a regular basis. And so, Dr. Brenson, we'll start with you, and then Kimberly, you can introduce yourself as well.
Well, I just want to say hello and thanks for having us. So I'm originally from upstate New York, Rochester, and I really got into this work actually as an intern on Capitol Hill. So I went there as a broke college student interning on the Hill and really kind of saw firsthand the importance that staff had on the Hill, especially Black staff and a CBC officer. I worked at the time for a CBC member. And so it was such a great experience, and that really colored my experience. And I went later on to get a PhD in political science, and part of my dissertation really looked at the importance of staff capacity, in particular of diverse caucuses. And so because of that experience, I later on, when opportunity came up for this job, I jumped at it because it really kind of mirrored my experiences both as an intern and then with my dissertation research, doing qualitative interviews with staff. It really helped me to understand, how much important staff on the Hill really are. And so, that's what really kind of helps to inform the work, right? Is that the staff are really at the center, and they really help to drive our work and research.
Awesome. Thank you.
So as LaShonda said, thanks so much for having us. So I'm Kimberly. I'm the Joint Center's research associate for the Hill Diversity team. I'm originally from Long Island, New York, and I actually joined the Joint Center team right after graduating from Cornell University, where I earned my bachelor's degree in human development. And so as a student, I kind of worked in multiple labs at both Cornell and Stanford, and I was really drawn to the Joint Center because I'm really passionate about racial inequality and racial diversity. And so it's just a perfect fit for me to be able to work with this team and, continue exploring the issues of, diversity, particularly on Capitol Hill.
Awesome. So welcome both of you. We're super excited to have you join today and talk a little bit more about the work that you're doing on a regular basis. And so for folks who are not familiar with the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies, it's described as America's Black think tank. And so how did the center come about, and what is the primary work that the center does on a regular basis?
Yeah, so the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies was founded in 1970, actually, so it's been around for a long time, and we have a bit of a resurgence. And so we produce research, data analysis on Hill diversity, but we also work on various other areas that are important to Black communities, like workforce development, economic policy, and tech policy. And so we produce a lot of research in those areas, and we hope that our work helps to inform policy areas, right? So if we think about how important it is in terms of AI and displacement of Black workers, if we think about expanding the earned tax credit in terms of economic policy, if we think about stopping online disinformation as it relates to voting, if we think about broadband access and adoption, how important that is, especially in this digital age, like post-COVID. We work on all those different areas, but as you mentioned, Kimberly and I in particular focus on Hill diversity.
Yeah, and so with that diversity, I know that y'all had sent over some of the data that you had been tracking with each, Congress, right? And so this is the 119th Congress. And so you all spoke about this racial diversity map. And actually, I had an opportunity to kind of play around with some of that data. I looked at our representative and I'm like, okay, we got some work we got to do on our
Yeah.
side up there. But can you talk a little bit about that research? And I think this is a second iteration of what that looks like. Give the listeners just a little bit of
Oh, sure.
feedback on that.
Sure, I can start. So, I think the average American maybe understands that they elect their members of Congress, right? But what's less recognized, this is important that top staff in particular, but staff in general, play in terms of the role in terms of informing policy. So, in particular, we launched a tracker for several years looking at the top staff diversity. So, when we say top staff, we're talking about chief of staff, legislative director, communications director in each office. And so we do a map. It's very cool. You have to check it out on jointcenter.org/Hill Diversity. But it lists each member on a map, shows where that district or state is for senators, and it compares the diversity within the state and seeing how each member of Congress compares that to the diversity in terms of top staff position. And then we use kind of like various colors and color psychology to say, if you're doing well, you're a certain color versus if you're doing not so well, that sort of indicates that color. And we focus on that because, like I said, top staff in particular really do a lot of the work on Capitol Hill as it relates to lawmaking, right? So if we think about the important powers that members of Congress has, these staffers really kind of assist them, right? And if we think about confirming federal judges, if we think about confirming, there's all these confirmation hearings, right? A lot of staff is really like drawing up the questions for those type of confirmation hearings, right? They're really kind of unsung heroes, if you will, in terms of what's going on Hill. And so we've been doing this work since 2015. The reason why it's so important that we do this work is that federal law actually requires a lot of federal agencies and companies to release demographic information as relates to their employees. However, Congress themselves actually doesn't release that information, right? So for us, we thought it was really important, and the reason was undergirding our work is that we want that transparency, right? And we, as a Black think tank, shed a light in particular on Black staff, but that data kind of spans across various groups. So I'll pause to see if I don't know if Kimberly wants to add anything else that I'm sure I probably forgot.
Oh no, I think that was pretty much a great explanation of the work that we do, LaShonda. Perfect. I don't have anything else to add.
So and like you said, a lot of folks probably don't lean into this type of data and even know that it exists, right? So we're excited to amplify, the work that y'all are doing because it is important, and we understand that working in community, but then also in the corporate space as well, right? We have things like the EEO1 report that has to be reported out on a quarterly basis, and so when you look about or you think about your research that you've done. What are the most striking disparities that you found in terms of racial representation at this point? What's popping up for you, and what are you kind of double clicking into at this point?
Oh yeah, I can take this one. So I think one of the most striking disparities that we found kind of across the board is the lack of racial diversity in top staffers in comparison to the U.S. population. And so that's a problem because, like as LaShonda mentioned, top staffers play like a really crucial and key role in the decision making of the congressional members. So like one of the things that we do at the Joint Center is a midterm hiring campaign. So every 2 years, that campaign focuses on encouraging members of Congress, particularly newly elected members, because they have more vacancies, to consider diversity when they're hiring their top staff. So during our campaign, we kind of provide periodic updates about the progress of hiring, including how many positions were filled and what the racial diversity is of the hires. And so in our final update, we kind of found that of the top staff that was hired by new returning members, 20% of those were people of color. But mind you, people of color make up 41.1% of the total US population. So again, 20% of top staffers are people of color, but 41.1% of people of color represent United States racial diversity. So that is a large disparity between what you'd expect top staffers to, the percentage of top staffers you'd expect in, Congress. And so similarly, if you look at Black top staffers, only 5.4% of top staffers on Congress were Black. And mind you, 13.6% of the US population is Black. So that's a really large disparity between US population and what we'd expect top staffers to, be in terms of their diversity. And so, top staffers playing a huge role in decision making, like that is problematic.
And so, can
And
y'all talk a little bit
oh,
about
sorry.
more of the decision making? And I'm sorry to cut you off, Dr.
No, you're
Brenson.
good.
Yeah, what are the type of things that they're deciding on, right? Because you mentioned how important their role is, right, and getting things done. So, can you let people know what that looks like?
Sure, I can add to that. I just wanted to kind of
Hmm.
underscore a point that Kimberly made, right, in terms of that 20%, in terms of it obviously compels in comparison to population at 41%. But I think what is really striking is that that is actually less than the number of diverse members of Congress, right? So actually, that percentage is at 26, right? And we know how hard it is for people of color, especially Black people, to win statewide elections, especially in
Right.
terms of making historic, wins for Black women. If we think about, in Maryland and in Delaware,
Hmm.
but the fact that like that percentage is actually higher than the diverse top staff, I think is really interesting and just kind of underscores the importance of our work. But just to add to the recent question that you asked, is that members of Congress are only one person, right? So like they have so much work to be done. They have offices in Washington, D.C. They also have district and state offices that are closer to the people, right? So on the district side, those staffers are handling district matters, right? So if you have an issue with your Social Security, if you need help navigating federal, processes as it relates to various things, the members of Congress, district and state offices often handle those kind of issues. On the national side, right, those staffers are handling things like their media relations, right, getting their member of Congress in front of various media outlets, making sure that they are aware of where that member of Congress might stand on a particular issue. And then also legislative directors are really engaged in policy, right? So there's a number of things before Congress. If we think about the budget, if we think about the economy, especially, is a huge issue, right? And so these staff, it's so important that they're diverse, right? Because we all bring to bear various, experiences as it relates to our background, and not just in terms of racial or ethnic background, but how we grew up socially, economically, all that kind of stuff. And so all that kind of informs the policy that is produced on the other side, right? And so it's important for these staffers to, bring to bear these various experiences, because that way that can help to inform a more responsive and diverse, policy outcome that is reflective of the needs of all Americans.
And I think that's such a great point that you bring light to, because I was recently watching this interview, and I wish I remembered who it was who was overseeing like the Social Security, right? And he had made a comment like, oh, with all these different cuts that are happening, in all these different agencies, he was saying, if my mom missed out on a payment from Social Security, she would probably just wait till next month and ask, oh, what happened? And this was John Hope Bryant, who was kind of highlighting this issue to say, oh my gosh, how many Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. And so if they
Yes.
miss the payment, that would be such a big deal, right? And
Right.
specifically in communities of color, what that looked like. And so, with you saying, hey, these are folks who can talk about different places and spaces in the United States and talk about the experiences of us as people of color, I'm sure that drives a lot of the conversation and what people might think about. And so in that element, right, when we're thinking about the impact on policy making, what do you think the staff impact of, developing those policies look like, especially those that serve marginalized communities, and specifically with people of color?
Yeah, I think unfortunately, people of color are already underrepresented in a lot of occupations, but we focus on a lack of diversity on the Hill because congressional decisions affect all Americans, right? And so this lack of diversity helps to, in turn, inform our policy, right? Like if you think about those policy gaps, right?
Hmm.
If someone is working on a policy and they say, well, from my experience, this wouldn't be a big deal if this didn't happen. But we obviously know, missing a paycheck or missing a payment for a person who are already on the margins, right? Like
Right.
that is catastrophic, and that can lead to a lot of different things. And so, what we like to really emphasize in our work is that this is not a partisan issue, that this is a real challenge that the institution must face. And so, obviously, we're not trying to claim that, oh, proportional representation is just automatically going to be a panacea and it's just going to be rainbows and
Mm.
sunshine, right? No, right? Because I think we also have to think about the intersections that exist even within diverse groups in terms of various different marginalized groups, even within that, right? In terms of that, right? But we do think it's important that that is a consideration, a part of the process, just as much. Like one of the things that's really emphasized on the Hill is, oh, you have to have a connection to the state or district. In the same way, I think, we can consider race, ethnicity, and inclusion in that process as well. And it's not something, and I think one of the things that is always bothersome is like when I have conversations around this is automatically if you consider race and you know, an ethnic, background, right, and
Mm.
hiring, is automatically this conversation about, well, what about qualifications, right? and, and
Right.
and it's very frustrating because I think that, one can exist, like they can coexist, right? And I
Right.
think it's frustrating when that aspect is kind of brought up into the conversation when we bring up, why this is important.
Yeah, and I think we're seeing that happen in real time, right?
Yeah.
Where there's a lot of conversations around, and we've talked about this, right? So DEI
Hmm.
means didn't earn it, and there's all different
Yes.
type of acronyms and things that are kind of popping up as it relates to this. But more recently, we've seen where folks are coming into, these different positions of power and authority, and they are not reflecting the professionalism, the amount of skill and background. So when we talk about DEI, right, like we talk about meritocracy being aligned in the same way, right? We have DEI so that meritocracy can exist because it doesn't without that conversation. So I appreciate you bringing that up as well. And so we think about these top positions, right? And so there doesn't sound like there's that many that exist, for a congressperson to have, right? So you talked about communications, obviously the legislative part, chief of staff. And so what are the issues with folks getting into these roles in the first place? There's not that many. What barriers to entry exist for people who are looking to have these roles?
Yeah, so I can take this one. So I think the barriers are kind of both institutional and cultural. I think particularly though our research kind of emphasizes and focuses on the institutional barriers a bit more. So for example, we actually did a report focused on like pathway or mid-level positions in the Senate, and that kind of provided us a little bit more insight into what these barriers are that prevent staffers of color from getting to top positions. So we define pathway staffers as essentially the positions that people hold before becoming those top level
Okay.
positions, right? So like obviously the top level positions being chief of staff, legislative directors, communications directors, but there are positions right below those that oftentimes people who are top staffers fail before they get promoted. So like for example, chiefs of staff, oftentimes chiefs are deputy chiefs of staff or senior advisors before being promoted to chief of staff, or even like legislative directors, they're legislative assistants or counsels. And similarly, communications directors, they're press secretaries or deputy communications directors before being promoted. And so in our report, we kind of found that while people of color, as previously mentioned, make up 41.1% of the US population, there are only 21.4% of pathway staffers were people of color. So, right, again, there's this large discrepancy between the percentage of people of color in the population and staffers. And so, additionally, why this is also kind of important is because a lot of experts and advocates believe that, in order to get more diverse top staff, we have to invest in the pipeline of mid-level or pathway staffers.
Mm.
So obviously having more mid-level or pathway staffers of color would allow for there to be more diversity in the top level because those are the positions that people get promoted to. And so like we found that since there's a lack of diversity in the pathway positions, the positions people have before becoming top staffers, that can affect the ability of staffers of color to be promoted to those top staff positions. So yeah.
And so it sounds like if the funnel is larger, right, you'll have a lot more
Yes.
people being able to be ready for those type of roles that are currently
Mm-hmm.
happening. And so if that funnel is limited, then we're going to see that reflected back
Yes.
in the folks that are coming in as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when you think about, the current administration, right? So now, obviously we have the Trump administration in place, but prior to the Trump administration, there was a growing emphasis on DEI, a lot of programming. Kendra and I both are practitioners in this space and do a lot of work here. But now there's this huge pendulum swinging back and saying, okay, this is divisive. This is, something that we shouldn't put a lot of emphasis on. And honestly, a lot of people are even talking about the erasure that's happening as well. And so when you think about the Trump era orders, right, it's signaling this shift in going back and, not having conversation around race. And so what do you think that the impact looks like on the federal government side, right? We're looking at federal contracting. I think there was a clause that was rolled back in an executive order around like segregation being okay now at the federal contracting level. So what are you seeing from those impacts, and how is that impacting the work that you all are in at this point?
Yeah, so we've specifically focused on congressional offices. So I think it's more of an indirect, I would say, impact. But we know obviously like for example, Black Americans especially make up a disparate number of federal employees, right? So if we think about everything surrounding that, we know that that disproportionately impacts Black workers, and really federal Black workers really kind of gave birth to like the middle class in terms of Black America. So we know that a lot of those policies, I think they're going to really feel the effects for a long time because not only the immediacy in terms of people losing their jobs, but if we think about really the federal government was really seen as a safe haven for communities of colors, especially in terms of getting stable employment that they could kind of look to and kind of work, right? And so I think that kind of has been stripped away. And I think it's created an environment that has really kind of moved the incentive for members in the federal government to hire and to emphasize that in ways, right? Because a lot of those programs, if we think about employee resource groups, all of those taken away and disbanded, right? And so there's not a lot of opportunity for diverse federal workers to really kind of coalesce and work on various issues, right? Because a lot of those things are removed because of the new administration. And so I think that can have a ripple effect, right? We've already seen it have a ripple effect on a private sector even, right? In terms of, their kind of sway. So I think it remains to be seen in terms on the Hill, what impact that's going to have on offices. I will say, I think that there has been, since it's so interesting in doing this work since 2015 as an organization, and I've been doing this work for the past 6 or so years. You really kind of see this huge progression, right? In 2020,
Right.
first post George Floyd, and so you kind of really see this kind of regression, kind of overall as it relates to this work. So I think it's kind of still in the very beginning stages, but I think we're going to slowly but surely kind of see the impact. One of the things that happened. I think this was pre the new administration, but one of the things that happened is on the House side that there was a House Diversity and Inclusion Office that got disbanded. It was a part of the government spending package that happened in March 2024. And so that really kind of dealt a blow because that office that was led by Dr. Session Moon really did a lot of bipartisan work in helping to get people hired and keep diverse candidates in particular in both Republican and Democratic offices. And so I think we haven't really seen the full scope and weight in terms of what that's going to have on the federal government, but also in congressional offices. But we've kind of seen it even in kind of the language that people use in a sort of bastardization, if you will, in terms of the word DEI, let alone.
Yeah, and so I think about a lot of the work that we've done in organizations where we say we hire folks, we get them in here, but because of the atmosphere and the culture that exists, they don't in general decide to stay in an organization if that's not strong. So I'm wondering, have y'all heard anything from that regard, right? From staffers on the Hill who, with this change in administration and now with this hyper focus on kind of erasing a lot of the, people who have come before us, right, and who have done this work, have y'all heard anything in that regard from folks on the Hill? What are they talking about at this point?
Yeah, so there's a lot of diverse staff associations on the Hill, and we've certainly been in communications with them. I think that they're still going and having events and things like that. They play such a crucial role, right? Because I think, like you mentioned, diversity is important, right? So getting folks through the door, getting bodies in the seat. But once they're there, cultivating their experience, right?
Mhm.
Because we know what it is to be, a diverse person in a not so diverse place in terms of, especially on the Senate side, right? And so we need those groups, right, to really help to cultivate community and inclusion, and to have a safe space to discuss the various things that might come up, and figure out different ways how you can uniquely navigate what it is to be a Black person or person of color on the Hill. And so that is super important. So they're already doing such great work, and we partnered with them on the past on several like op-eds and pieces that are featured in like New York Times and other pieces like that. And there's some quotes directly in those pieces, but they really kind of speak firsthand about what it is to be a Black staffer or a person of color on the Hill. And I think they're truly the experts, and they really help to inform the work that we do. And we could not do our work without the partnership of those organizations on the Hill.
Yeah, and so Kimberly, I'm wondering. I know research is obviously both of y'all do a lot of the research, but are there any research
Mhm.
points that have been very alarming to you, or any surprising research points that you want to kind of tap into and talk about and amplify as well?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that is particularly alarming is, African Americans being only 5.5% of top staff,
Mhm.
but despite the fact that they're 13.6% of the US population. And so looking at, for example, our pathway report that I mentioned earlier, we found particularly there was like a unique retention and recruitment pattern, particularly for Black staffers, right? So one of the things that we look at is, okay, for Black staffers on the Senate, because there's so little of them for top staffers, we were looking at, okay, like, how long are they staying on the Hill, and their promotion patterns, and in terms of like, are they being promoted, are they changing offices, right? And so one of the things that we found is that of the Black top staffers that were working in 2020, by 2023 they had all left, so
Wow.
none of them were retained. Yeah, which was very shocking, because for other racial groups we find that they have longer tenures on Capitol Hill, particularly in the Senate. And additionally, another thing we found particularly specific to Black top staffers, is, so for our Senate report, we found that there was only 6 of them actually that were in office in 2023. And in order for them to receive or get to their top positions, all of them had to move offices. So for example, other racial groups such as Asian Americans, white, Latinos, what we found is that they essentially had mid-level positions within their offices, and maybe like a chief of staff like changed offices or decided to leave the Hill, right? So offices would essentially promote those staffers to those upper level positions. But for Black top staffers, for some reason, they were being essentially not promoted and passed over when considering them to be promoted for those top positions. So particularly for Black top staffers in the Senate, they're not retaining long tenures in their top roles, which could be for multiple different reasons. But in addition to that, they're also being passed up for promotions within those same offices, which is concerning. And so I think like one of the things that we are pushing for is to, encourage members of Congress to recruit, retain, and promote more Black top and mid-level staffers. And I think also too, another thing that's also concerning is just looking at, oftentimes a lot of members of Congress that are Black tend to also hire Black top staffers, which is amazing, because obviously like having a more diverse Congress is important, and they're kind of pulling up their staffers to also reflect that diversity. But the issue is that Black people live all across America, and oftentimes they live in areas that have their members of Congress not being other Black members, right? And so, or they live in areas that aren't large bastions of representation for Black folk, right? And so what we want to see is, we want to see all members of Congress hiring Black top staffers. And particularly we saw like white members of Congress, they hired actually less than 5% of white members of Congress had Black top staffers, right? And obviously white members of Congress are the largest group, but they're hiring basically minimal Black top staffers. So like the emphasis shouldn't just be on Black members to hire Black members all across the board. They should be hiring and retaining and recruiting other Black members of other Black top staffers and mid-level staffers as well.
And I just want to add to Kimberly's point, this data is pre the new administration, right? So to your earlier question in terms of sort of what's going to happen, right? In terms of, as you can see, if you're, our data shows if you're a Black mid-level staffer to get a promotion, you have to literally leave your office, right? There's a lack of opportunity when it comes to promotion within office for some reason for this particular group, but not for any other group. And again, this is pre the new administration, so it'll be interesting to see, for example, if we did this data again, sort of what results might occur. But I just wanted to underscore that this was supposed to be still kind of in that good stage in terms of this racial awakening, right? And so I just thought that I just wanted to highlight the kind of context undergirding the data that Kimberly spoke to.
Which, I mean, to your point, right? Like this was supposed to be the good years, and now we're still seeing, the need for that to shift and change. And so, we'll definitely stay in touch too on the data and what that looks like over time. But Dr. Brenson, you had mentioned early on, right? Like there's not necessarily this office, all these other organizations, corporate, we have to do things like EEO forms and uploading that so that we know what the breakdown looks like within organizations. And that didn't exist, and that doesn't exist on the congressional level. And so I'm wondering how, right, like, I don't know if there's exit interviews or, things that the corporate world does to kind of get that feedback directly from staff, but how is that also shared with other members of Congress? So how are you getting the word out? Obviously, you're on our podcast, which we're super excited about, but how are you getting the word out to those congressional members so that they're aware of this tracking and what's happening?
No, that's a great point. So they definitely are aware.
Okay.
And how we know is if they're on our naughty list, and by naughty I mean in terms of one of those offices where they have a very diverse, state or district, and I don't want to name any names, versus their staff, they will contact us, right? Like senators and members of Congress will literally contact us, and so that has happened. And it's because of the work under, we were mentored by Spencer Overton, who's not currently our president, but, he had a lot of, influence on our work and kind of led our work. But a lot of our times we're fortunate enough our work ends up in public spheres, right? So, like I mentioned, our work has been New York Times, Washington Post, various news outlets, The Hill. And so all these outlets, because it gets in the public domain, a lot of times, congressional offices will read it. Another thing too, with our campaign, we encourage, average American to use our information and say, hey, ask your member of Congress, what about this? What is happening with this? And so we had a lot of public education aspect of our campaign as well, in terms of doing social media outreach and education, because we think it's really important that average Americans ask their member of Congress about their data, because I think they really don't like hearing from them in terms of like you mentioned, you're a member, right? In terms of, hey, use that data and say what's going on with this. And so, and because not a lot of people collect this data, they know it's coming from us, right? So we certainly get that feedback from member offices, and we use that opportunity, right, to engage members. And so we've met with a lot of Republican and Democratic offices about our data. They've asked, for tips, and actually, before we started collecting data, one of the things we used to do is we actually used to do more direct hiring. This is before my time, but we used to collect resumes and things like that. And we haven't done that work in years, and we'll still get calls from offices because they know that we used to do that work. And that's another way that we can engage. So we look for a lot of different opportunities to partner with offices to raise awareness. And we do so by, sharing our data and saying, hey, look, you could do better in this aspect, and, that kind of thing. We use that for opportunity to engage. But those are kind of ways that we try to do it. But it can be interesting.
Yeah, I'm sure. They're like, oh, shoot, I'm on this list. Let me call somebody and see what I got to do to change that. But I want to talk a little bit about both of you, right? So you talked about your experience and your own journey, right? Your educational journey, your own careers, and kind of getting you to this position. Kendra and I, we actually did a live podcast last year at the Congressional Black Caucus, which was an amazing time, and just meeting folks that are in this space. We're all getting together, seeing what people are doing across the country and having conversations. Obviously, there's a lot of fun that happens at these events as well. But I'm just wondering, what really resonated to get you in this space and positioning yourself to do this work? And then what would you say to folks who might be interested in getting into this work, and how might they best do that?
I can start, or go ahead, Kimberly, actually.
I was going to say that I also was at the CBCF conference last year. So it was a great time, amazing time. I think for me, so a little bit of my personal experiences. So I actually moved to DC essentially right after graduating from undergrad. And for me, it didn't even really cross my mind to consider a job on Capitol Hill. For one of the main reasons being is the previous representation from my home district, again, not naming any names, but their group of interns actually had no racial or gender diversity. So on their social media, on their listing of promoting we want to hire interns, it was all just white men, all of their interns. And so for me, as a Black woman, that largely impacted my perception of, would I, have a space on Capitol Hill, and it might not be a place for someone like me, considering looking at all the interns that they're promoting, what they looked like, where they came from, And so I think for me, I really believe that racial diversity on the Hill is extraordinarily important, because I think that everybody from all types of backgrounds, should be able to aspire to a place. And if they really want to work in Capitol Hill, they should be able to do that and to be comfortable. And so I think that, we need more people that look like me, that look like, a lot of different people, different backgrounds to work in Capitol Hill, because obviously, right, all of us have representation, all of us have congressional members, senators. And so, because we have that, we should all be allowed to also work in those offices as well.
Yeah, and I'll just say, like I mentioned, I intern on the Hill, and I guess another thing too, right, is that I saw firsthand the lack of diversity in terms of it was not a lot of people that looked like me on the Hill working in congressional offices. And I think, I had a fortunate opportunity to interview a lot of Black staffers for my dissertation work. And it was really informative to hear directly from them in terms of their experience and while they're doing the work. I think, to think about a question earlier that you had is about, what's going on? Is it institutional? Is it cultural? I think Kimberly certainly spoke to institutional aspect in terms of our data and things like that. But I think from a cultural aspect, one of the things that I learned firsthand is how insular the culture really can be on Capitol Hill, right? And I think it's very hard to navigate it. I think especially if you're a person of color, and I think especially you're a person of color who comes from a disadvantaged background, like myself, it was very challenging for me to intern unpaid, for that semester. There's a lot of sacrifices that I had to make. And I think about that, someone similarly situated, it's, very expensive in Washington, D.C. One of the things that is that happens in tandem with the conversation about the lack of diversity is the fact that these positions oftentimes don't pay a whole lot of money, right? And you could very easily pivot to a different position and double, triple your salary, right? And so I think that's another challenge that we constantly face in terms of this conversation when we talk about lack of diversity on the Hill, is the fact that the pay is just not where it needs to be if we think about living in a high cost of city like Washington, D.C. And if we think about oftentimes, not everybody, but some people of color have to financially support, they're the person that quote unquote made it out, right? And they have to financially support their family in certain ways too, right? So there's a lot of different considerations. But I think that's some of the kind of cultural and economical aspects that kind of lead to what we see in terms of results as it relates to lack of diversity.
I'm not going to shout her out, but I have a friend who works on the Hill, and she's in one of these top positions that you all are mentioning about. I also know the culture in terms of the hours, right? Like the time that has been being put in working. And so I want y'all to kind of talk a little bit about that as well, right? So folks are
Hmm.
sacrificing, to your point, on maybe things like pay,
Yes.
but then what is their schedule? What does their schedule look like, and
Yes.
how do they kind of manage that as well?
Yeah, I mean, work is life for a lot of these staffers, right? I
Yeah.
think, they can work upwards hours of, 80 hours in a week, and some even have, other jobs, right? And,
Hmm.
because they want to have to figure out a way to supplement their income. Some even have outside employment, and it's very hard to have like work-life balance and stuff like that. So it's very challenging in a lot of ways, and I think that we have to really consider, and like I think the institution really needs to invest more in their workforce, right? Because how can we say, they're bringing their best to the table when they have to
Right.
have another job and they're overworked and and underpaid, right? And it's just really challenging,
Yeah.
for the
Mhm.
staff.
Yeah. So, what would you say to the young person who is interested in public policy? I'm also thinking about
Mm-hmm.
someone who works on my team. She's actually getting her master's right now in public policy. She's at Michigan, and there's a lot of
Go
conversations that are
blue.
happening right over there. And so she has been thinking about that, right? Like, what do I do after
Hmm.
this? She loves the work that we're doing in this DEI space, creating
Hmm.
more equitable organizations.
Hmm.
But a lot of her classmates are thinking about, hey, what's next for us after we graduate, right? And where are the
Hmm.
opportunities that exist? And some are even becoming, really yeah, they're discouraged
Disillusion, yeah.
with what's
Hmm.
happening, right? Like
Yeah.
currently in this administration. So when they say they think that the system's not created for them, they're going through all this, they're trying to navigate what that looks like. What would y'all say to them? What kind of message would you want to resonate with them?
Yeah, so I think like understandably, like it's no question like why they feel that way because the system
Hmm.
like hasn't been designed for young people of color, right? Like historically speaking, the political system hasn't been very inclusive, like and also too knowing politics and policy like often have been shaped by people, who don't represent the full diversity of the country. So
Hmm.
like those, I think the first thing just to like acknowledge like those
Right.
feelings are valid. I
Hmm.
think, however, on the positive note, there has been like multiple signs of progress. Of
Hmm.
progress. So, for example, the 119th Congress, there's been a trend in the past seven Congresses, and this one is also included, where every single Congress has had more racial and ethnic
Hmm.
diversity than the
Hmm.
last, right? So I think that like kind of shows that we're shifting towards more inclusive representation every single Congress. And additionally, we're also having more young members of Congress. Like for example, Maxwell Alejandro Frost, right? He was elected in the
Hmm.
previous Congress, and he's the first Gen Z member to be elected to Congress, right? So there's more
Hmm.
younger people aspiring to like roles in Congress, and it's also like showing that like there is more room for like new fresh perspectives and
Hmm.
policy ideas coming from the younger generation. And so I think
Hmm.
like even though like there's still much more work to be done, like I
Hmm.
also like definitely feel it too as like a young person of color. I think that
Hmm.
like we have an opportunity now to and the power to be the change that we want to see because we're going to be the next generation in politics and policy. And so I think that like I encourage like fellow young people of color to kind of like believe that they have the power to make an impact, and push to help continue, opening doors for us that traditionally, have been closed to younger generations of color.
Hmm.
I don't know, Dr. Brenson, if you wanted to talk a little bit as well on that. How would you encourage the
Um,
the next generation that's looking to get into this space?
yeah, I mean, I feel like Kimberly covered that well. I guess the only thing I would add is, like she said, I really want to validate people of color in this moment,
Hmm.
because I think that, now we've regressed so much to the point now where we have to, before we can, like, for example, talk about our work and, the numbers and stuff like that, we have to now, justify why diversity and inclusion is important, right? Whereas, I think, several years ago, I thought we were kind of past this conversation, but we've kind of gotten to a point where we have to kind of, have these kind of base level conversations. And so I would say, to the extent that you have the bandwidth and you have the desire to engage in those conversations, I think you have to make space for that. I would say if you want to do this work before you can get to a space to talk about the work, because I do feel like we're kind of in that moment, and I do
Yeah.
think, and I would say outside of the work, it's just like take care of yourself and like self care, because I think like we're in a time where I think it's becoming particularly like draining for various reasons for people of color. So I would say to take care of yourself outside of the work, and to, it can be hard. You can feel like kind of bogged down, but I would say certainly I think there's still opportunities, I would say, in this work. I think it's just, harder to seek those out. But because there's been a lot of things that have been repealed or kind of renamed and stuff like that. So I would say, seek out those opportunities still, but understand that we're in a very different climate, right? Yeah. So I think like, even for example, like diversity, equity, inclusion, they were talking about changing what E means in that, just kind of like all that kind of stuff. So.
A lot of different nuances, right? Like, oh, let's just change this or shift this and,
yes.
call it something else, reframe it
yes.
from that standpoint. And so, folks that are listening, right? Like I'm sure this is a lot of new information for people because they don't, they sure. just don't know, right? And so we're sharing this information to amplify the message that you all are doing and the great work that you're doing. But for ordinary people who are maybe tapped in and listening to this and, they're trying to think about like, well, how can I get involved in this? How do we ensure more accountability at that level? How do we talk to our policymakers to have them know that, hey, we are paying attention to this, and what messages might you encourage people to share with their policy members?
Yeah, so one of the things that we encourage concerned citizens to do is if you don't know what congressional district that you live in, that's okay. If you go to house.gov, I think it's /representative /find your representative, you can put in your zip code and information, and you can figure out what congressional district you live in. And if you go on to our website, jointcenter.org/showdiversity, if you click on our 119th tracker, you can look at your district and kind of see what, how your particular member of Congress is doing. And I would say, take that information and ask their office, about that and what they're doing. Ask them if they, are aware of these statistics, and is there something that they're doing about it? Emphasize the importance of, I know my member of Congress is only one person, and I want the staff to represent my interests. And I would say pair that to any current issues that you're having in terms of like bringing that up. So when you contact your office, I think that's super important, because I think member of Congress really respond to when they hear directly from constituents in their district, right? In terms of, because that's a potential vote for them in the next election, right?
Right.
So if you raise that, with them, I think that's super important. And I would say if you want to subscribe to our newsletter, obviously we, Kimberly and I focus specifically on Hill diversity, but we do a lot of work on economic policy, tech policy, and workforce. And I think all of those issues, I think, are super important to communities of color, especially now. And so I think that's a great way to be informed about our work in general. But I think that's a way, if you want in particular to address your member of Congress, that's something that you could do.
Look, y'all got to check this list, because like I said, I was tapping, then I started getting nosy, like, okay, what they doing over here in California? I'm looking at them. I'm like, I'm looking at these states where you would just assume there's going to be larger representation. And I'm like, all of us need to do some work, right? Like you see it.
Yes. And that's something that we emphasize in our work, because I think a lot of times, one might automatically assume, oh, this is a problem for Republicans, right? Right. No, this is a problem for all members of Congress. There are some great people that do great things in terms of as it relates to hiring diverse top staff, and some people you might even be surprised by, but it's really a bipartisan issue, and that's what we really try to emphasize in our work, right? Because the numbers literally pale in comparison to the diversity within the U.S., right? And so it's not just in Republican offices, it's in Republican and Democratic offices, and that's what we really try to emphasize in our work. But like Kimberly said earlier, one of the things that we do notice is that people of color in Congress tend to hire a more diverse top staff. Like she mentioned, it's not the people of color live in all U.S. states, so it's not, the onus is not just on them to hire diverse top staff. Because if a member of Congress doesn't represent the average member of their district, they need a diverse top staff to lean on to say, okay, like I need to be informed about this issue. How can I be better informed to, have these economic issues and make sure that people in our district who are suffering, really have their interests represented in the policy, if that makes sense. So.
Definitely makes sense. Yeah. And so first of all, I just want to thank both of you all for coming on. We really love the fact that y'all reached out and said, hey, we're doing this. We know that you speak about DEI. And so let's amplify this message. We were really excited about that and the work that y'all are doing. We always do a gem of the day, right? And so we wouldn't be the Black Gems Dive-In podcast without a gem of the day. And so I just wanted to kind of open it up. What do you want folks to know? What do you want to share, and what's on your mind right now as it relates to what you're doing? I might be putting y'all on the spot, right?
No, I know you did. So one, I want to say thank you for the opportunity for having us on your platform. We really appreciate the work that you all are doing. It really is a pleasure and an honor to be on your platform. I would say, I think for me, I would just emphasize what I had just mentioned in terms of taking care of yourself. Like I said, I
Mm.
feel like this time can feel very heavy and kind of all consuming. And I think if you're, I feel like I went to Michigan, right? So seeing
Oh,
that they're
okay.
rolling back DEI, stuff is really disheartening if we think about the role that Michigan played in like affirmative action in general, right? So it's just all this stuff kind of continues to happen. And I feel like it can complicate our relationship or like, to our institutions that we went to, we're like, oh, go blue. Oh, not really. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it's just, it really kind of complicates, right? Our feelings in terms of how we relate to where we went to school or just kind of all this stuff, right? But I would say, take this moment to really kind of take care of yourself. I would say also disengage or engage in
Mm.
conversations wisely and protect your peace. And I would say arm yourself with information. So yeah, I think that's top of mind for me right now.
Awesome.
Yeah, I
Kimberly, what
think
about
like
you?
on the flip side, like I also totally agree with everything LaShonda said, but I also think on the flip side, like if you are like do feel anger, like let that anger
Mm-hmm.
and hatred like drive you. Like don't allow it to,
Mm-hmm.
keep you down. Like if you are angry and you see like, hey, your member of Congress isn't diverse, you can reach out to
Mm-hmm.
them. You can like make some noise. You can tweet them. Like granted, like at your own like advice, so be careful with that. But like there are things that you can do to like create
Mm-hmm.
some change and like put some pressure on people to have the
Mm-hmm.
outcomes that you want. So like if you are somebody who is feeling enraged and wants to do something, there are a bunch of things that you can do, and there's change you can make. Particularly like I feel like oftentimes for younger people, for people of color, for underrepresented people, like they might feel as if their voice isn't as important. But I think no, like their voices are particularly important like right now, considering everything going on. So
Mm-hmm.
if that's not your lane, if you want to relax and recharge and protect your peace, totally do that. But I think also too, if you're ready to go out and make a little bit of make a little bit of like moves to start
Mm-hmm.
fighting and moving and trying to change things, totally do that as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's what I would say.
Yeah, and I mean, at some point in time, right, these things are going to switch back, right? The pendulum
Yes.
goes left, it goes right. But at
Mm-hmm.
the end of the day, I think this is an awesome moment in time as well to get in,
Mm-hmm.
to lean into the conversation and start to drive some of that work, even locally. We often talk about like get involved locally, right? Talk to
Mm-hmm.
your people locally and see what you can change and shift in your own community. I see a lot of things are happening, and now that they're talking about rolling back education and getting rid of some of the conversations in the school. There's other folks who have started school for Saturday for just learning about history and getting involved and
Mm-hmm.
engaging the youth. And so I think you both are spot on with your gems in terms of what people might do and what they might not do at the same time, because there is a
Mm-hmm.
lot of stuff that's coming at us on a regular basis. And so before we close, where can people find y'all? And is there anything else that you want to share with folks that are listening?
Yeah, so our work can be found at jointcenter.org/Hill Diversity. So you'll see our recent press statements, or you'll see a link to our 119 tracker that we talked a lot about, and our recent reports. And so you can stay up to date, and then you can sign up to our newsletter to get updates on our other work in terms of other areas that mention tech policy, economic policy, and workforce.
We might have to bring you back
Mm-hmm.
on some of those other conversations
Oh
too, right? Like the
yes, yes,
tech policy.
yes.
I'm
Oh
in, I
yes.
work in the tech space for some of the things
Mm-hmm.
I do extracurricular style. And so,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I would love to have conversations around policy and what's driving on that end too.
Definitely.
Mm-hmm. And I think also just to like plug, like we're currently working on our newest House report, and I think particularly like now, considering like all the change in things like DEI and like the closing of the House Office of Diversity and Inclusion, like I think it's going to be interesting to see like how top staff diversity has changed in the House from our previous report. So that's supposed to be coming out sometime this year as well. So
Mm-hmm.
we're excited about that.
Yeah, definitely hit us back up when that report comes out, because we would love to have you back on and chat about, maybe some of the shifts that we've seen since. So thank you both so much for your time this afternoon. We appreciate it. Y'all, we were joined by Dr. LaShonda Brenson and Kimberly Victor. They're from the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies, which is America's Black think tank. And so thank you both for coming on. Looking forward to continuing to stay in touch and look for that update in your work soon to come.
Thanks for having us.
Take care.